The pharaohs of ancient Egypt were buried in elaborate tombs, from the first pyramids built in 2600 BC to the famous Valley of the Kings, where generations of royal families were buried for 5 centuries. The elite and middle class of ancient Egypt also had their own cemeteries and individual tombs. And these tombs, with their rich hoards of jewelry and goods, were for centuries the targets of tomb raiders. When Ernest Wallace Budge arrived in Luxor in 1887, tomb robbing was an ancient profession handed down from father to son for generations.
Many natives dealt openly in antiquities. They detested the officials of the Service of Antiquities, for they were convinced that their one object was to get hold of antiquities, not to preserve in the Museum of Cairo, but to sell on their own behalf. They were ready to deal with anyone who was not a servant of the Egyptian government.
I am selling to you because you bought from my family before. But you must not lead the Frenchmen here. Understood?
I will not. I can promise you that, Hassan.
Budge is often rather vague about exactly where he found things, and that's because he was dealing with antiquities dealers who would tell him secondhand where they might have found them.
Budge was most likely taken to Kurna, a village on the west bank of the Nile, very close to the Valley of the Kings. Here, the inhabitants built their homes on top of a cemetery of nobles, which they systematically plundered throughout the 19th century.
These are the best treasures.
19th dynasty. I may be able to give you a good price. Hassan, what do you want for it all?
200 pounds.
Done. Can I look at that?
It is trash. Broken treasure. It is worth nothing. Take it.
Oh my God. The seal is unbroken. Gentlemen, I believe we are looking at a document that has lain undisturbed for 30 or more centuries. Hail to you, Ra, creator of the gods. Ramsey, what we are seeing here is an untouched, pristine Egyptian Book of the Dead, made for Ani, scribed to the Pharaoh.
To an Egyptologist like Budge, a scroll was a fascinating artifact. But to an ancient Egyptian like Ani, the scroll was the key to life in the hereafter.
Well, the Egyptians believed that the afterlife was a dangerous place, and this probably symbolized the crisis of death. For the Egyptians who loved life, death was a tearing of the fabric of society.
To the ancient Egyptians, death was only the beginning of a journey, fraught with peril.
For the Egyptians, death was a crisis to be overcome, but they were optimistic, so they believed that it could be overcome, but not without a series of trials or travails.
The Book of the Dead illustrates a dangerous world where the deceased is threatened by terrifying beings.
When hieroglyphs were used in a magical book like the Book of the Dead, they became magically active. You might liken it to a video game where you had to go through a series of episodes where you would have to fight off enemies or go past clever obstacles. In fact, they would damage hieroglyphs that had a threatening aspect because they might kind of get out of control. So for example, one of the most common hieroglyphs is in the form of a horned viper, one of the most deadly snakes in the world. It's used a lot in spells and different texts, so they would chop it in half so the snake couldn't leap off a wall and attack the owner.
But if the hieroglyph was not damaged, it could come alive and attack. For Ani, his protection was the spells from the Book of the Dead. The Egyptian afterlife also included allies.
Based on texts like the Book of the Dead, we believe that the deceased would have immediately been greeted by the god Anubis, who was known as also opener of ways and the guide of the dead through the afterlife.
Anubis is a very prominent god in the netherworld and also in connection with the actual mummification and ritual burial of the dead. He always appears with the head of a canine, and he's identified with the jackals and the other kind of wild canines that existed in Egypt and tend to live on the fringes of the valley where the cemeteries are. So there was always a kind of close association between these wild dogs and the world of the dead.
The god Anubis is both a guardian and a guide for the deceased. It's his job to make sure that you get to judgment safely and that you can get to everywhere that you need to go.
One of the most important chapters in the Book of the Dead is a mysterious ritual called the opening of the mouth.
What I love about this ritual is they didn't just symbolically open the mouth, but they also opened the eyes and the ears, which is very much a philosophical statement.
The opening of the mouth ceremony was a spiritual awakening of the body. So once the deceased had died, his senses were shut down. And this would allow the body to become a vessel for the soul of the deceased. So they could see, they could taste offerings, they could smell incense, they could hear the prayers that were being said, and then they could actually actively use objects like the Book of the Dead to help in their journey through the afterlife.
The dead person has a goal in the underworld, to reach the field of reeds, or field of offerings, a blessed place where the deceased can live for eternity. But to get to the field of offerings is a long, difficult journey fraught with many dangers. Any one of them could jeopardize Ani's chances for paradise. Now in Luxor, Budge was only one step away from the French and Egyptian authorities. His unorthodox methods clearly got results, but they were making him powerful enemies.
Look at this, Ramsey. Over 3,000 years old, and the colors on the scroll still glow.
It is almost as if he is still alive. Are all books of the dead like this?
No, and I've seen my share. This is the discovery of a lifetime, or several lifetimes. So we better make sure this gets home safely.
Aywa, marhaba, Effendi. Mr. Budge, will you join me and my family for some coffee?
Budge was almost ready to go when he was interrupted by some very unwelcome guests.
Turkish coffee for all the workers. Coffee, coffee.
Coffee? No, thank you, Mr. Budge. I'm far too busy arresting antiquities thieves. Omar, tell the men to confiscate all these items.
This belongs to me.
These belong to the nation of Egypt, and you belong in jail. We've already arrested all the other treasure hunters in this neighborhood. But it looks like we've saved the best till last.
See here, Drabo. These men are employees of the British government.
Please be quiet, Mr. Budge. You have made me look like a fool once, but you will not do it again. Make sure the caravan is loaded in the morning and ready to leave for Cairo.
With the scroll in the hands of the authorities, Budge knew it might be lost to the world forever. Or worse, stolen and cut up for souvenirs on the black market.
I find myself in most dire circumstances, jailed in Luxor, accused by the French, of all people, of being a tomb raider. And all this after having discovered perhaps the greatest find of my career. An ancient burial scroll belonging to a scribe named Ani. Rich in color and full of fantastic images, thousands of years old, I believe it represents perhaps the first time man has expressed his spiritual beliefs in writing. Truly a profound discovery. Of course, I need time to study it in order to fully grasp its meaning. Sadly, I am unlikely to ever hold it in my hands again.
For the scribe Ani, his Book of the Dead was now a map to the Hall of Judgment, where the gods would determine whether or not he deserved to live for eternity in the field of reeds. But getting there could be treacherous. The spells included in the Book of the Dead provided protection from demons that could attack the deceased. One spell provided protection against a giant beetle called the Asharu that could eat the deceased. The underworld was a strange place. The Egyptians thought of it as a confrontation with chaos.
After creation, there was this island of rightful order created. But a large part of the universe remains uncreated and chaotic and therefore irrational. A lot of the Book of the Dead deals with this type of irrational magic, of fighting irrational forces with irrational means.
3,000 years later, in 1887, the scroll of Ani was in the hands of authorities. And Ernest Wallace Budge had his own obstacles to overcome.
The sense of helplessness is overwhelming, knowing that every moment I sit here in this wretched cell, the scroll of Ani is further from my reach.
بادج الإنجليزي وحسام السارق، أنتما حران. انطلقا من هنا. انطلقا. راح.
ما راح. ليش? How did you get us out of here?
أنا ما شفتك.
بخشيش.
Experience had taught Budge that the scroll may not be safe, even from the guards.
They know the scroll is worth more if they break it up into 20 smaller pieces. Grabo won't even notice anything is missing until all the pieces are sold.
Oh dear, this is worse than I had imagined. Once it leaves that storehouse, it will never be put back together again. Any ideas?
I did notice something. That hotel. The storehouse is built against its wall.
Wallace Budge has always had a mixed reputation. Even then, he was notorious for the levels that he would go to in order to acquire things for the British Museum.
Budge revealed in his autobiography how he developed a plan.
Now, among the houses that were sealed and guarded was a small one that abutted on the wall of the garden of the old Luxor Hotel. This house was a source of considerable anxiety to me, for in it they had stored the papyrus of Ani, a talk with the hotel manager was my only hope. So you see, the treasures of Egypt are about to be destroyed, or at the very least shipped away to France, all due to an unfortunate misunderstanding with Monsieur Grebeau. However, the treasure can be saved. In fact, some small treasure might even find its way onto the walls of your inn, and only certain accommodations would be necessary.
What kind of accommodations?
Budge hired several local men to tunnel through the hotel wall and into the storeroom holding the scroll of Ani.
It's astonishing how fast they work.
Men like these have been digging out treasures from tombs in their basements for centuries. A 50-year-old hotel wall means nothing to them.
But with only a night before the scroll was due to be moved by authorities, would Budge's daring plan be enough? Or would his discovery of a lifetime be lost forever? For the ancient Egyptians, life didn't end with death. Death was just the beginning of a long and arduous journey, a journey that could end with salvation or annihilation. Ani hoped his Book of the Dead would bring him to a life in paradise, but he would have many tests to come, and anything could happen. If the wandering soul followed the directions in the scroll, he would eventually find his way to a final challenge, the Hall of Judgment. Here he would face 42 separate gods in front of 42 separate doors. In front of each god, he would have to deny having committed a particular sin. It was one of the greatest challenges of the afterlife.
If you don't know the correct answers, the correct thing to say at this point, you presumably are not going to be able to get through that gate and pass successfully into the next life.
These 42 commandments that Ani would have to deny having broke are called the negative confessions.
It's a litany of things that the deceased didn't do. So he says, I did not go out and murder anybody. I didn't steal anything. I didn't fool around with somebody's wife. I didn't do this, that, and the other thing. It's very informative and revealing about what probably a lot of Egyptians did do.
But only through the spells in the Book of the Dead could a person make it through the negative confessions.
One should not confuse this with the notion of confession and repentance. This is really a magical incantation to wipe the board clean of whatever you might have done on earth.
One interesting fact is that most of the 10 commandments can be found in the negative confessions. Could the 10 commandments, written several hundred years after the Book of the Dead, be lifted from the negative confessions?
There's nothing in the Book of the Dead that says that there's only one God. There is nothing that says that only one God may be worshipped. However, almost all of the 10 Commandments, the things that are prohibited by the 10 Commandments, do appear in the Book of the Dead.
Egypt was the home of Moses. It's easy to see a variety of ways in which the Book of the Dead and Egyptian culture have influenced the Bible.
Whether or not the negative confessions are the source of the 10 commandments, the Egyptians believed that a person must have lived a good life.
There are a lot of gods who would say, well, what did you do? And they would pose, it's almost like going through an exam. So they would pose test questions to the deceased to see if they had done right or wrong.
You have to open every gate. And these gates were not easy to enter. It was guarded with these huge scorpions, and you have to answer their questions or they will eat you.
Ani faced each god as detailed in the Book of the Dead. Gods with terrifying names like Swallower of Spirits and Breaker of Bones.
Awasih. Pira Miana.
Anish Anata.
With each correct response from the Book of the Dead, Ani could move forward through the doors. Only after the final door could the soul of Ani meet the god Horus, the hawk-headed son of Isis and Osiris, who would escort Ani to his final test in the Hall of Judgment. The decisive moment in the Egyptian Book of the Dead is called the weighing of the heart.
The ancient Egyptians visualized many challenges waiting for them in the afterlife. One of the most important was to successfully undergo this judgment before the tribunal of Osiris and be found worthy to become one of the blessed dead.
The dead person's heart is the symbol of his intelligence and his emotions and even his mind.
The heart is, of course, where your essence lay and where your sort of good and bad deeds were.
The deceased would then hand his heart scarab amulet to Horus to be weighed against the single feather of the goddess Ma'at.
Ma'at was a goddess who is basically the personification of truth, justice, order, balance.
The heart could not be heavier than truth, but it couldn't be lighter either. It had to balance out. It's interesting that those phrases also continue to exist in our language. You know, you talk about somebody being lighthearted or heavy-hearted.
No deceased wanted to be stuck just relying on their own purity of heart. Hence the Book of the Dead, with the appropriate magic spells that kind of make up the difference, help you get through by the skin of your teeth. But there is an option that you might not pass the test, and if you are not making good use of your Book of the Dead magic spells, you would be thrown to the monster, Amit. She is the devourer of souls, the devourer of the dead.
The job of this monstrous creature, which combined a crocodile, a lion, a hippopotamus, ferocious creatures like that, was to instantly devour any deceased person who was found guilty there in the Hall of Judgment.
If Amit eats your heart, you cease to exist. For the ancient Egyptians, that was the scariest thing. It wasn't punishment, it was not being able to exist at all.
The stone heart scarab, which represented the dead man's heart, was now put to the final test, a test for eternity or oblivion. When Ani reached the Hall of Judgment, he knew his trials in the land of the dead were nearly over. Only one test was left, one which would determine his fate for eternity. After losing the scroll of Ani to Egyptian authorities, Ernest Budge was now attempting to get it back.
The house where the antiquities were stored abutted on the wall of the Luxor Hotel. Workmen began to dig under the wall and cut through the soft, unbaked mud bricks into the house.
I'm telling you, I heard something.
No one could get in here with us guarding the place.
Make sure the caravan is loaded in the morning and ready to leave for Cairo. Without fail.
It seemed unwise to rely overmuch on the silence of our operations, and we therefore arranged to give the police and the soldiers a meal, for they were both hungry and thirsty.
Gentlemen, I have been ordered back to England, I'm afraid.
Many will miss you and your little gifts.
Budge was a very strange character. You have a good side and bad side of Budge. The good side is his publication. The bad side is what he did to steal from Egypt.
And I would like to present to you gentlemen a little token dinner representing my gratitude and friendship. Ramsey!
تفضلوا 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 يا جماعة.
Eat well, gentlemen.
Budge knew if he was caught, his career would be ruined, and he would likely spend many years in an Egyptian prison. But to him, it was well worth the risk to recover such a priceless masterpiece.
Whilst they were eating happily, man after man went into the house and brought out, piece by piece and box by box, everything which was of the slightest value commercially. In this way, we saved the papyrus of Ani.
3,000 years earlier, the Book of the Dead was believed to be invaluable to Ani. It was his one guide through the trials of the weighing of the heart, and his one chance for eternal paradise.
Ibi moati, mikofsi ari dejawa, mirioka, arimaba, irimaki, midushi, digarik, arai, agasnata.
This was a spell that literally told the heart not to rat on you. So the spell was designed to keep the heart from saying, oh, by the way, you fooled around with somebody else's wife, or you stole something, or something like this. You were just supposed to say, no, you were just fine and dandy, no problems.
Some people have suggested that the heart scarab might have been a way to cheat one's way through the weighing. But I think that it represents more the concept that a person needs to be emotionally calm and ready for that to happen. You know, he needs to be one with his emotions, because the heart for the Egyptian was the seat of his emotions.
The scroll of Ani helped its owner finally pass the weighing of the heart in the Great Hall of Judgment. His journey over, his ordeals complete, he could now enter paradise in the blessed field of reeds. In 1887, Ernest Wallace Budge was about to face the end of his own perilous journey.
Guard! Open that door! Bouge-toi, vite, hein? Stand aside. Go and check the caravan. It's gone! It's all gone!
Budge and his treasures were already on a barge headed for Cairo, and eventually London. By December 1887, he was back at the British Museum. With him, the complete scroll of Ani.
For the first time, museum goers will be able to examine the entire Book of the Dead.
Though what Budge did next is viewed by some as archaeological vandalism.
When he got it back to the British Museum, he cut it into sections that he could work with. He arranged for it to be pasted to wooden boards so that it could be translated. From a technological point of view, one can almost forgive him. But on the other hand, he destroyed the integrity of the papyrus forever.
Budge spent the rest of his life at the British Museum as a keeper of Egyptian antiquities. Most of his 140 books are still in print, and even those are controversial.
He wrote a lot of popular books, but he wrote them quickly and without a lot of care. And in fact, his translations were already out of date when they were published in the 1890s.
Budge has a very mixed reputation amongst Egyptologists. He produced a lot, but his scholarship was not always considered sound, and his ethics of collection certainly left a great deal to be desired.
I myself, until today, read his books. His books are very important. I think that the only bad thing about Budge, that he did steal antiquities.
Were it not for the massive amount of material that he published, perhaps flawed as it was, there would not be the interest in Egyptology and ancient cultures that there is today.
He has done more to popularize the Egyptian Book of the Dead and to popularize the notion of the Egyptian afterlife than perhaps any other scholar and any other text that was published.
Whether Budge was a scholar, an adventurer, or even a thief, the Scroll of Ani was his greatest contribution to the world of Egyptology. He never made a greater find, nor has anyone ever discovered any other scrolls as artistic or complete as Ani's Book of the Dead.
I wonder what the young man in the picture would think of all this.
I don't know. I suspect he wouldn't mind. Ani wished for immortality. With the scroll in the museum, the name of Ani will be read and remembered by millions of people.
I suspect you're right.
And wherever Ani is, I hope he can give us his blessings.
I think as long as we have human questions about the meaning of life and death, the Book of the Dead is actually going to remain quite relevant. The ancient Egyptians wrote that book not because they longed for death, but because they adored life and they wanted it to go on. The Book of the Dead imagines that the most blessed place you could be is right here on earth.
Ultimately, the Egyptian Book of the Dead is a guide for the living, a guide of how one should live life on earth, a life of morals and ethics in order to obtain an afterlife. But the mysteries of the ancient Egyptians remain, and it is these mysteries that lie at the heart of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The mysteries of life, of death, and of the hereafter are eternal. Mysteries that can only be understood by faith, hope, works of the imagination, and the heart.
Using the foundations of experimental archaeology, next on the History Channel, Chad and Eric recreate the hardships of English prison life in the Middle Ages in Surviving History.